conversation. I'm here with Mel Mcgowan, who's the president of Visioneering Studios, does creative concept development, all sorts of stuff, man. How you doing?
Awesome, man. Good to be with you today.
Now, you've been key in designing resorts, colleges, churches, Disneyland. I mean,
about a 10-year stint there.
Now, creatives are known for kind of being all over the place. You know, it's really hard to hone in on what exactly a creative person might do. So, what in particular do you do to help keep yourself focused? Like, what do you do?
Well, architecture is kind of interesting because it's kind of this balance between science and art, and even Disney Imagineering, where a lot of people assume that it's a bunch of kind of wild-haired, crazy, fat pencil, wacky designer guys just getting to, have these brainstorms all day. I mean, the reason it's called Imagineering because it was about engineering the imagination, and that was kind of the same idea behind naming the firm Visioneering. It's not, most architects, we joke, they have this alphabet soup name that's the initials of the founders or the guys that own the company. And the reason we went with the name Visioneering was it was very much about the idea of engineering this God-inspired vision into reality. And it's really not particularly our vision. I mean, it really is about getting with our clients and facilitating a process where we're able to articulate kind of, again, that God-inspired vision that he's kind of given them stewardship over. And so we try to kind of stay out of the way and facilitate that process. And obviously a lot of what we do, a lot of what I blog about at our, my blog and kind of what I tend to write about tends to be about this idea and that hovers around this passion for place, and the theology of place, and kind of getting that, and God's a God of place from, the beginning of time, where he creates this great environment for horizontal and vertical simultaneous connection in Eden. And then really throughout history, whether it's the wilderness, whether it's the tabernacle, whether it's the city of heaven, that he's always used space and place in a very particular way to kind of be a basis of relationship. So for me, one of the things that helps fuel the creativity is definitely just traveling and being in places. And in fact, one of the things that keeps our designs fresh is because we definitely really try pretty hard to not ever have like a firm signature or an architectural style. It really is about going in and exploring whatever context, whatever mission field we're working in, and almost kind of being cultural anthropologists first, and really coming in and really trying to get under the skin of kind of the psychographics, the demographics, where people live, where do they hang, what's the cultural competition. And as I've done that, I've found myself to be a pretty easily won over guy that can become a fan of a place, and I don't care how much of an armpit that city is. Right. I can't tell you how excited we've got a project planned in the Detroit metro area in a couple of weeks, and that's one of the few cities in the U.S. that I actually haven't been to yet, and I can't tell you how excited I am to get in there, because I just believe God's a God of beauty, and he can redeem. He can find beauty in ugly things, and there's just a real power to the idea of redeeming place and space, and certainly never would have the cockiness to think that we're the first ones that God is ever doing or using to do that. So wherever we go, we find that whether it's his people or artists that, were created in his image, people who have gone before us, there's usually some little, seeds of the kingdom and of beauty and redemption in almost any place we can go to. Right. Part of our research and R&D project is finding those.
So having designed so many, buildings and creating atmosphere in churches, what is, say, like kind of a step-by-step process for that you guys go through?
Yeah, we have a process that we call the Visioneering Blue Sky process that really was kind of a culmination of like 4 or 5 different streams of our different backgrounds. I mean, on the one hand, we had that Disney storyboarding process that was kind of, back in the 20s when Walt Disney was doing the first feature-length animated films, he would do these storyboard, process, gag, brainstorming processes that really hadn't been used in the motion picture industry up in that era, and now it's real common. So there's kind of that element of that Disney kind of storyboarding, scripting, and experience kind of process. there's a second layer of doing international urban design mixed use that a lot of our guys have been involved with, where, you're needing to come in and take stakeholders that might be opposed to a project and bring them in and along for the ride, basically, so that at the end of the process they're kind of co-owners and co-authors rather than what we call NIMBYs, not in my backyard people. There's kind of a third strand of hospitality resort design where a lot of our guys were doing international resorts around the world, and they basically have to fly into Indonesia or whatever, and within about a week, with not only the project developers, the owners, but get with the local government officials, walk the site, learn the local building context, how people have been living for thousands of years. And then kind of a final strand is the mission field, where we've all been involved with, going to Ghana, whatever third world country, and being humble enough to figure out, hey, these people have been living in this context for hundreds of years. Maybe there's something to God's architecture and kind of the natural created environment that we should pay attention to in terms of how the sun rises and sets and the water flows and the topography and the land sits. And maybe we should really document that, pay attention to that, as well as, the cultural local building styles and means and methods that have been, definitely time tested, and come up with a solution based on that. And so I think those are kind of a couple of streams that show up together. But then when we actually do that blue sky, we're there for a week. Again, we walk in without having drawn anything. We don't pull out the rubber stamp. Hey, we did this 500-seat multi-useless gymatorium in Idaho, so it should work for your local context. We're pretty intentional about, again, just shutting up, asking the right questions, and making sure we facilitate some dialogue. And really, at the course of the 5 days, what bubbles up from that tends to look more like what could be, rather than just a technical master plan, something that could be kind of God's good acceptable and perfect will, for the stewardship of his site. And so we like to think of it as trying to discover the master's plan for the site rather than just a technical, master plan solution.
What should churches be thinking of when they're planning on, whether buying a building, building a building, renting, etc.? I know that oftentimes they're just so amped to get into a space that maybe sometimes they don't think about what that space is actually going to facilitate. Or
no, I think you hit it on the head as far as thinking about what that space is trying to do and be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, it's definitely asking the bigger question of definition of church. I mean, what, is this really about, because I think the whole contemporary modern church movement was about really kind of an impoverished definition of what the function was. And it was really about get them in, get them out, get the cars parked, get the butts and seats, get talked at, get performed at in this black box event space, and then get them the heck out of there so that you could flip it for the next hour or the next service or whatever. And as we've really gotten into the definitions, that's where it's really powerful, because if the definition is really a lot more about busting down those walls and tearing down the walls between the internal community of faith and the external community, that obviously is going to look like a totally different design solution. If the true definition is about relationship or ecclesia, breaking bread together and those sacraments of communion, that's a totally different, outlook. I mean, because that's about relational environments where you can actually have a conversation and maybe even make a new best friend. That's totally different than walking into a black box, anonymous, get in, get out kind of situation. So, we found asking the right questions and really getting real precise definitions and answers of what the actual function is about.
What would you say are some of the biggest mistakes that churches make or businesses make when it comes to their facility?
Well, I think of it, just in a nutshell, I think one of the simplest big mistakes is kind of a bad theology of place, number one, and a bad theology of stewardship. For example, when you talk about theology of place, I mean, to me, there's this great meta-narrative in the Bible, again, from the Garden of the City of creation, of kind of brokenness, and then recreation, renewal, redemption. Right. And I think a lot of well-meaning, Christians have this idea of, hey, it's all going to burn anyways, and nothing we can do can be worth much of anything. So let's get her done, throw up a piece of crap, and if God's going to fix it all, he'll burn it, and he's going to build a city of gold, and and again, and I'm not I want to be careful because, I mean, I understand where their heart is, because their heart is like, man, there's people dying out there. There's people, we need to, rescue people from, flamage of hell. Let's get out there, take the few kingdom resources we have, and, just keep the rain off our heads and do what we need to do. So it's very much this kind of emergency. I'm not talking about the pendulum swinging the opposite end of building these big opulent cathedrals, but again, there is a balance there somewhere in terms of understanding the idea of being a steward in God's garden is the idea that there is room for beauty and grace. And I think that kind of segues into the idea of a definition of stewardship. Again, I don't think when Jesus talks about stewardship, it's about getting her done for as cheap as humanly possible. I don't think he defines stewardship as being as cheap as humanly possible. I think that really talks more to the idea of bearing the talents rather than what Jesus seemed to talk about as far as thinking about kingdom return on investment. And if you could spend, $10 here and bury it, or if you could spend $10 differently, apply a little more brain juice and creativity and actually, maximize that kingdom harvest, I think that's the way to go. So I think we've definitely fought pretty hard to help people kind of understand that you don't have to have this false dichotomy of, okay, it's either cheap or it's good. I think the idea that you can actually do something for the same price as ugly, generic vanilla, right, but actually, have something that actually is culturally relevant, that is a relational environment and connected space. It's probably hard to see behind me, but we just moved in. We built our home studio here. It's one of our 5 locations across the country. And basically our ministry spent $0 on it. We used a completely boring, generic landlord, what's called a TI allowance, a tenant improvement allowance. It's built into our lease, and it's what every other group in our office complex did, to create this completely Gilbert land vanilla, boring space with whatever, what I mean, the fluorescent lights. Yeah. Whatever, but we said, hey, let's not do the drop ceiling. Let's leave it open. Let's do concrete floors, whatever. And it's this great creative, think tank lab. We've actually got this whole garden to city narrative as you walk through the space. It's a great space that tells our story of the work we're doing internationally as well as locally. And so it's the idea that a space can be intentional, that you can tell stories, that you can create meaning, but it can also be highly functional and effective. And again, without paying a premium, is kind of gospel. It's good news to some people.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Well, speaking of that, what would you say are some creative ways for churches to improve their spaces for, cheap, just the, economy's bad, cheap. What can they do for cheap that looks good?
Well, there's, you kind of it's kind of dangerous when you start just giving like the simple rule of thumb, kind of thing. I mean, there's, obvious things like I was mentioning here. I mean, you can do the ugly knee-jerk solution of dropping in the T-bar ceilings, the fluorescent lights, picking the ugly carpet, but again, why do that when you can actually, it looks better if you leave that stuff off to begin with, things like, people are so afraid of color, but, God invented more than just, vanilla, or beige, and, it's kind of funny because, when you realize that you can actually do this great, warm color scheme that, can create a unique sense of place or create some different feels throughout the space. And that's actually the same price as, that white paint that everyone seems to go with.
Sure.
So those are just like simple, low-hanging fruit kind of stuff. At a bigger level, some of it actually has to do with the definition of campus. We've gotten into this campus paradigm model that, in terms of certain churches, it's about kind of this either looking like this open-air campus or that's kind of internally oriented, for kind of believers only. And what we've really gotten into shifting that paradigm around is to more of an externally focused kind of community center that in some cases looks, tastes, and feels a little more like some of the gathering places that a non-Christian would actually want to gather, whether they were thinking, for whatever reason. And so, the idea of thinking about spaces between the buildings rather than just focusing on the square footage of the buildings themselves. I mean, some of the ugliest churches I've been to in America have 20 to 30% of their actual air-conditioned, heated square footage in these ugly hospital-like double-loaded hallway corridors. And when you really get creative, you can actually do what a lot of the lifestyle retail mall developers have done, which is take a lot of that fat off and just don't build it as internal space, but actually, frame up some of the different core anchors around kind of an outdoor, village green or something that, there's just lots of different ways of kind of taking the program and being a lot more efficient and intentional about it. And that's big bucks. I mean, if you can cut out 20-30% of the building fat, now you've got, let's say that's $100 a square foot minimum. Now you've got money to, add some special sauce, throughout the area that you are building. So a lot of it has to do with big picture thinking in terms of the overall real estate development process, financing, funding, and programming. So it's not so much as, hey, I'm going to try to be really creative by using a cheaper construction material or a cheaper chair or whatever. It really starts at the big level, but then it goes all the way down to the level of furniture, fixtures, and equipment.
So would you say that maybe sometimes simpler is better?
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty good rule of thumb, but it's, like I said, the problem seems to be almost mental. It's how you define simple. Because I think you can get overly simplistic and think you've landed that definition of simple. Because you think about, I think a lot of people might apply that word clean or simple to Apple's product design, but when you think about the stuff beyond the form factor, there's a lot of stuff there that is not exactly simple. But again, there's a balance between what level are you thinking of simplicity. I mean, when I think in the church world and the church leadership world, you automatically go to simple church and that kind of model of, hey, it's just about the Sunday experience and get them in, get them out kind of thing. And again, as I mentioned, I think that can be somewhat limiting in terms of as you start building a facility that now is automatically going to sit dead or closed for 6.5 hours a week. It really is going to be somewhat of a black hole in the community as far as, it doesn't pay taxes, either property or sales tax. It doesn't generate any social activity. And it's just not a place that, that unchurched. I'm thinking about that Samaritan, or that Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. It's for that person that didn't get up thinking I'm getting dressed and going to church this Sunday. It doesn't really give them much of an opportunity to encounter some words of eternal truth in the daily course of their life, or to meet, pinky on the body of Christ. So that's kind of, I don't know if I rounded that answer that, but
no, perfect.
But with that said, though, we tend towards some pretty simple structural solutions. Pre-engineered metal building, no problem. Let's talk about different ways to, put layers on that, whether it's graphics or, whatever, but we tend not to do these really crazy structural acrobatic solutions. So there's definitely a lot of power to that statement.
Can you speak to the need for churches to bring in companies like yourself, ministries like yourself, to come in and really maybe lend a consulting point of view? Or
Sure. There is definitely a standard operating procedure in terms of how churches typically think about church facilities and design and building those environments. And the reality is that SOP is pretty dangerous, because people assume that, hey, that's the way it's always been done, it's the way it should be done. And frankly, if you simply compare it to how the real world gets buildings done and developments, it has very little to do. And so I'll pick on that straw man for a second, because again, it's guys get out of seminary and somehow, I don't think they're training this, but somehow they just assume this is how it goes. So the idea of getting a voluntary building committee and having that unpaid team of volunteers be a de facto project manager, then going out and hiring a local, Mr. Brady church architect who had all his ideas 30 years ago and has been rubber stamping it ever since, and then going out and doing a hard bid construction process. Again, none of this has anything to do with the way real projects get built. So, from our perspective, what we've tried to do is kind of figure out where the kingdom need was, and we feel pretty strongly that it was to be the scalable national one-stop shop, dream to dedication day provider. So, I've got two partners. One's our VP of design and architecture. The other one's my VP of development, and he's a licensed contractor. And we've got this integrated solution that doesn't have the typical adversarial relationship of architects versus contractors, and he said, she said, and that idea of integrating that construction estimating process when you're still in preliminary and concept design is so key, because there's all kinds of scary statistics out there as far as 3 out of every 4 church plans have to get thrown away because the architect went down this path, taking the wish list of the church, and then finally they figure out, oh, we can't afford this. Oh my gosh. So then the architect has to get paid to redraw the stuff. There's lots of other scary things about, the number of pastors and building committee members that end up quitting the church after either failed or successful building projects. And then of the projects that do get built, that's the scary thing. I mean, Barna did a study over a 7-year window and looked at the amount of money spent on new church construction. Even though we doubled the amount of money as a nation that we threw, presumably at the project of making room for the lost, we actually had a directly inverse attendance, people going to church per capita in America in relation to the actual U.S. population growth. So it's not like build it and they will come. If you can even get it built, that's still no guarantee. You've got to kind of figure out what you're doing and do it right.
How do you stay creative, and not get stuck in that rut of, this is how we're going to make the buildings and create the atmosphere? I mean, do you draw your inspirations from just kind of what's out there, from movies? Where are you pulling your
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have this, I think of it as kind of facilitating this process, really, where it's this co-creative process. It's definitely not limited to, me or any one Visioneer's kind of creative capacity. It really is a carefully kind of scripted and proven process of tapping into the creativity that's latent, again, in the believers that, are part of our client teams, in tapping into what God's already been doing in a local city, in a community, and being humble enough to kind of listen and search and ask the right questions. Definitely always reading, always seeing films, all that good stuff. I'm a huge fan of, production design and media. So, there's all that kind of stuff that you look at. I do things other than just reading. We've got some great clients that are great thought leaders, but I found that they're not as interested in me regurgitating their book back to them. So as far as what I'm reading, as far as blogs and stuff, it definitely tends to be outside of that Christian thought leadership world because, I'm really more interested in what's going on as far as, urbanism and global sustainability and creativity and film production design than I am necessarily in terms of means and methods of how to do church,
Right. Anyone in particular that you could say that's maybe outside of the church world that you learn from, glean from when it comes to this stuff?
Well, it's kind of interesting, just from a historical legacy perspective, Walt Disney, someone that actually would, I think, he's been dead a pretty long time now, and I think most kids, going to a Disney park today would have no stinking idea who this guy was. But, he's someone that's been kind of interesting because in a lot of ways, kind of my life journey or path kind of paralleled his in terms of, starting off kind of just doing doodles, and then getting into film and then kind of getting bored with two-dimensional, okay, it's in the can, you're done with it, and then getting interested in the third dimension of thinking about more three-dimensional filmic environments and theme parks. And then really on his deathbed, he was completely bored with entertainment, and his biggest fear was that anyone would remember him as being just this guy that came up with Mickey Mouse as his greatest gift to the world. He really got to have this real burden and passion for community. And, again, when he died, it was mid-'60s. You had all the urban race riots in Chicago, Detroit, you name it. And he was really passionate that his last legacy would be this city on a hill, this experimental prototype community of tomorrow, this kind of experimental kind of idea of what would it look like if we figure out how to do life together and we do it right, and so that kind of burden or passion for community, I think is something that kind of followed me, and that I ended up getting my master's in after doing film and after being at Disney for 10 years. I ended up getting that master's in focused more on urban and community design and planning. And I think that's been kind of an interesting influence, even as I was working within the company that he founded and even leaving and really focusing on, okay, how do you really talk about and think about holistic, sustainable community in terms of, spiritual sustainability as well as economic and environmental, and recognizing what a killer anchor tenant and what kind of glue, faith-based communities are to that larger kind of idea of community. It's not just about pop jet fountains and, great Class A retail tenants and vertical mixed-use clean streetscapes. You've got to have that social glue in there and part of the mix. Now,
you're actually, speaking of planning and, urban planning, or not urban planning, what did you say? Basically creating societies and whatnot. You guys have just done something pretty incredible, or doing something incredible right now in the Philippines. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a project pretty near and dear to our heart. I mean, we think of it as kind of, biblically, God talks about the, cities of refuge. It's an amazing project called My Refuge House, and it's this parachurch ministry that basically some college graduates found out about the issue of child sex trafficking, and they just had no idea, and they're finding out the stuff about this premium that's paid for 4-year-old little girls, and they went to International Justice Mission and they said, "Where's your greatest need?" And they pointed them to Cebu, Philippines, and so we're designing and helping develop this little, I mean, it's like this tribal village kind of layout of these a house parent and 6 gals in each of these, very indigenous, stick tribal open air huts. But basically, it's this therapeutic, secure compound facility that is kind of, it provides this 3 to 6 month psychological detox window where they can be rescued and not, be tempted to go back into, the situation they came out of. And so it's just an amazing thing to be part of. And again, for International Justice Mission to say, look, every girl that, we've got girls already identified that we can rescue from being raped tonight. So if we can get this bed for them in the secured compound, we can really do something here. And it's something that's definitely lit a fire, under us. And we've been able to partner with a couple of our clients to buy a site to get this thing going, but it's definitely something that we're trying to help spread the word on. So that one's called myrefugehouse.org. And really, again, a lot of people are familiar with International Justice Mission, but they've even said to us themselves, I mean, they can identify the girls, they can prosecute the perpetrators, they can even work with local law enforcement to pull them out. But they're not really about long-term, short-term or long-term care these gals. So it's a pretty killer project.
So myrefugehouse.org?
Yep.
Cool. That's awesome. And lastly, your website, do you have a Twitter? Can people follow you, get some creative ideas from your tweets? What's your...
Yeah. I mean, it's visioneeringstudios.com is the website. As far as Twitter, I'm at Mel Mcgowan, McGowan. I've got a blog at melmcgowan.com that's kind of, following the Visioneer, as far as our different Visioneers around the world as we travel around. Some pretty exotic locales, but again, it's about the idea of being passionate about place and how God's using place and how He's redeeming place and space in some pretty unlikely places. So we definitely get to encounter some pretty interesting characters along the way, and love to share the journey with people.
Hey, thanks so much, Mel. I appreciate it.
Great talking to you. Thanks, man.
You bet. Think International, Visioneering Studios. Wow.